Hey everyone, how's it going? Sorry it's been such a long time, but we're back. In the last video, which was a while ago, sorry about that, we looked at the cell signaling pathway of steroids, applying the standard formula of production, packaging, release, response, and termination that we've gotten so used to. But today we're going to be looking into different types of steroids. So we're going to be looking into what makes them different from each other and get an idea of what different types of steroids do. So let's get started. Also, before we get started, I just wanted to give a shout out to my first year cell bio profs who teach Health Sci 1I06 at McMaster. A lot of the information and lecture slides in this video I got from their lectures, so thank you to them for spreading the knowledge. Alright, so just to review what steroids are, they're a family of lipophilic messenger molecules that are produced on demand. They travel through the blood to their targets in order to produce responses necessary for our bodies to function. Now there's different types of steroids, but in this video we're going to focus on two big types, corticosteroids and sex steroids. So corticosteroids are produced in the adrenal cortex of our adrenal glands. Glands are responsible for hormone production, and one of the glands in our body is the adrenal glands. Adrenal glands are found on top of the kidney, and they have an inner part, the medulla, and an outer part, the cortex. The outer cortex is where corticosteroids are made. On the other hand, you have sex steroids, which are produced in the gonads, which are your reproductive glands, such as your ovaries and your testes, and they regulate sexual characteristics and reproduction. Okay, so corticosteroids and sex steroids are two main types of steroids based on where they're produced. But these two types are further divided into different classes. So, under corticosteroids, we got glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. And under sex steroids, we got progestogens, estrogens, and androgens. So it's easy to remember because these both end with corticoids and these all end with ogens. So, like we said, two types of steroids, and within each type we have different classes. And within each of these classes we have specific examples of steroid hormones that are produced in our body and they do various functions. And you can see these examples in this chart here. So examples of glucocorticoids includes cortisol and corticosterone. In humans, cortisol is the much more relevant and potent steroid. Our main mineralocorticoid is aldosterone and our main progestogen is progesterone. Types of androgens include testosterone and also DHT, which stands for dihydrotestosterone. Estrogens, they include estradiol, estriol, and also estrone. So we'll touch upon the differences between these in a little bit. So all of these different steroid hormones can bind to and activate different receptors which will produce different responses. So the sex steroid receptors are quite straightforward. You got androgen receptors, estrogen receptors, and progesterone receptors for your androgens, estrogens, and progestogens. Now for your corticoids, your glucocorticoids have their glucocorticoid receptors and your mineralocorticoids have their mineralocorticoid receptors. But what's interesting is that there's a lot of cross-binding here, meaning that aldosterone can also go and bind onto your glucocorticoid receptors and produce the response that normally your cortisol does. Just like that, your cortisol can also go and bind onto your mineralocorticoid receptors and produce the response that normally your aldosterone would produce. So it's important to note that in this case, it's the receptor that determines the response, not really the ligand. So does this cross-binding happen with sex steroids too? A bit, but nowhere near as much as what happens with your, glucocorticoid and your mineralocorticoid receptors. Okay, so now let's take a look at this map down here, this map of steroid synthesis. So from your common steroid precursor, which is pregnenolone, different enzymes can get to work in order to produce a variety of corticosteroids and also sex steroids. So these are nicely color-coded. Under corticosteroids, we have gray mineralocorticoids, green glucocorticoids, and then you also have your purple sex steroids. So the color coding makes it nice and easy to tell them apart. So a lot of the steroids in this map, in this diagram, are ones that we just mentioned. So an enzyme can turn pregnenolone into progesterone, which, as you mentioned, is a sex steroid. From there, other enzymes can get to work in order to produce corticosteroids, for example, aldosterone or cortisol. they can also turn it into this thing over here called androstenedione. And androstenedione is basically a precursor to a bunch of sex steroids. So it can be turned by this enzyme into testosterone. And then 5-alpha reductase, another enzyme, can turn testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, also known as DHT. Aromatase is another enzyme, and aromatase is interesting because it can turn androstenedione into estrone, and it can turn testosterone into estradiol. So remember that testosterone and DHT, these two they're both androgens, whereas estradiol, estrone, and estriol, so these three, they are all, as the name suggests, they're all types of estrogens. Okay, so now let's briefly look into what all of these different steroid hormones do, starting with our androgens. So remember, androgens, we got testosterone and DHT, dihydrotestosterone. Those are the two types that we mentioned before. So, what is the difference between them? Well, the main difference is that DHT is way more potent. It has a much higher affinity to androgen receptors. It's able to produce the same response with a much lower EC50. Remember, in the past we made a video about dose response curves and potency in EC50. If you want a reminder, be sure to check it out. It's down in the description below. But yeah, they're also responsible for different things in the body. So testosterone is involved with sperm production, a regulation of libido, and producing secondary sex characteristics, mostly in males, such as increasing muscle mass and deepening of voice. On the other hand, DHT is responsible for the development of the prostate, as well as regulating body hair growth and sebum production. So those are your main types of androgens. Okay, so now let's talk about estrogens. So we mentioned that under estrogens we got estradiol, estrone, and estriol. And between all of these, estradiol is definitely the most potent, followed by estrone and then estriol. And each of these are relevant during different stages of female sexual and reproductive life. So during times of fertility and reproduction, estradiol is the most prominent, regulating a woman's menstrual cycle as well as ovulation. During menopause, estrone becomes the main hormone, supporting cardiovascular and bone health. And then during pregnancy, estriol takes over. It promotes uterine growth as well as, uterine growth as well as blood flow to the fetus. And unlike the other two, which are produced in the ovaries, estriol is produced in the placenta, which makes sense because it's so active and relevant during pregnancy. So we should mention that men do actually produce estrogen and women do produce androgens. These two sex steroids keep each other in balance, but the balance leans heavily towards androgens, such as testosterone for men, and towards estrogens, like the ones we've seen for women. Now there's the other sex steroid, which is progesterone. Like estrogen, progesterone is also much more prominent in women than in men, but its main focus is all to do with pregnancy. So it works alongside estriol, except progesterone is way more important. It's critical for pregnancy. So it does all sorts of things, like it thickens the endometrial lining of the uterus, which is important for fetus development. It also helps prevent early contractions that can lead to premature babies or miscarriages. And it also helps develop milk glands so that they'll be ready for breastfeeding once the baby is born. It does other things as well, but these are some of the highlights. So that summarizes the types of sex steroids and their functions. So now let's shift over to the corticosteroids, starting with mineralocorticoids. So mineralocorticoids are responsible for regulating the balance of water and ions in our blood. And the main mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. It's produced by the adrenal cortex, which is part of the adrenal gland that sits above the kidney. So, like we said, it's a mineralocorticoid that regulates water-salt balance in order to increase blood pressure. So when our blood pressure is too low, that's going to stimulate the release of aldosterone. And aldosterone is going to help raise blood pressure to return it back to normal, and that is going to cancel out the stimulus that originally caused it. So it's a negative feedback loop. So basically the way this works is our kidneys, right? They're responsible for filtering our blood and removing waste from our blood as urine and excreting it out of our body. And aldosterone modulates this process by increasing the reabsorption of sodium ions from the nephrons of the kidneys back into the blood. So imagine these are like your blood vessels. It's going to increase sodium reabsorption back into your blood. So that means we're going to urinate less sodium, and we're going to retain and hold on to more sodium in our blood. And because of osmosis, water in your nephrons is going to also follow. As sodium gets reabsorbed, water is also going to get reabsorbed. It's going to leave your nephrons, and instead of getting passed out as urine, it's also going to get reabsorbed back into your blood. So this helps to retain water and sodium, which increases blood pressure and volume. And remember, that's the whole point of aldosterone. It's to increase blood pressure when blood pressure gets too low. Okay, so the way that low blood pressure induces aldosterone release is the following. So basically your kidneys, right? They detect low blood pressure, and in response to this, your kidneys will release renin. And renin will react with angiotensinogen, which is a liver hormone, and it'll turn this angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Then, your lungs have this enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme. And as you can imagine, they're going to convert your angiotensin 1, turning it from angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is then going to do two things. One, it's going to stimulate vasoconstriction, and two, it's going to cause the release of aldosterone from your adrenal glands. And as we said, aldosterone is going to cause a reabsorption of sodium and water. So both of these things together, vasoconstriction and reabsorption of sodium and water, is going to help increase blood pressure. And this is cool because it is now going to negatively feedback the original stimulus of low blood pressure that induced the release of renin in the first place. So the system works to lower the stimulus that originally caused it. The original problem was low blood pressure, but with the help of the system, we're able to increase blood pressure and cancel out the stimulus. Finally, let's take a look at the second cortisol type we mentioned, which is glucocorticoids. Okay, so glucocorticoids, they regulate homeostasis, immune function, and metabolism. So cortisol, which is the main glucocorticoid, is known as the stress hormone, and it's involved in producing stress responses which are triggered by stressors. Stressors can be physical, emotional, environmental, and cortisol will produce responses such as increased blood glucose, increased blood pressure, increased heart rates, which help to deal with the stressor. Okay, so the mechanism of cortisol release is the following. So stressors are detected by your brain's amygdala. Then your amygdala is going to activate something called the HPA axis, which consists of the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the adrenal cortex. So hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, HPA, that's where we get the name HPA axis. So in response to the amygdala's activation, your hypothalamus is going to release your hormone CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone. And that's going to stimulate your anterior pituitary now to release ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. And that is finally going to release your adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids, including cortisol. And cortisol then inhibits the release of CRH and ACTH from the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. So I'm going to say that again. Glucocorticoids, or cortisol, is basically going to tell your hypothalamus, like, okay, now I'm released, you don't need to release any more CRH. So it's going to negatively inhibit the release of CRH and negatively inhibit the release of ACTH from your hypothalamus and your anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary. Sorry. So it's a negative feedback loop that helps keep cortisol levels under control. It prevents your cortisol levels from getting too high. Okay, so this negative feedback loop is really important because if cortisol goes out of balance, it can lead to diseases and consequences, introducing Cushing's disease and Addison's disease. So Cushing's is when you have too much cortisol. Addison's is when you have too little. Cushing's can have symptoms like weight gain, muscle weakness, high blood pressure, and high blood sugar. Addison's is somewhat the opposite: fatigue, low blood pressure, low blood sugar, and weight loss. So basically that concludes today's overview about the steroid hormones of the body. I hope that this video helped you get a better understanding of the difference between your corticosteroids and your sex steroids, as well as the types of steroids, within these two classes, and examples of steroids for each type, as well as where these steroids are made and what they do and what happens if you have too little or too much. This wasn't meant to be an exhaustive lesson, just a brief overview at some of the most common types of steroids and their features. So I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, I'd really appreciate if you left a like, comment, or subscription. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. We're probably going to look into the signaling pathway of a whole new molecule. We'll see. Sorry again about the big waits, but I'm going to try to be making videos more regularly from now on. So I'll see you guys next time. Bye for now.